Welcome. Thanks very much for joining us today. Dr. Ferraro is beside me, and we will be sharing this webinar, slipping in and out of certain groups of slides based on our experience and expertise. So without further ado, we will commence with the PowerPoint. Before we do that, though, we would just like to say that, just to acknowledge really the support of the Office on Violence Against Women. We've listed our grant number up here, and just to note too that our opinions, findings, conclusions, recommendations do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. So we just wanted to clarify that. So our rationale today to talk about interviewing perpetrators with a view to understanding intimate partner homicide and perhaps other domestic violence related deaths that fatality review teams might review. We want to be clear, both of us, that we're not here to condone or excuse or in any way justify acts of killing. It's not our intention either to traumatize either perpetrators or to traumatize surviving family members, but we just feel as though we've reached a point in our work, and nationally we've reached a point where we needed to have a conversation about how to conduct these interviews. Many more teams are conducting these interviews now, and we thought the time was right to reflect just a little bit. Dr. Ferraro and I have both had a lot of experience interviewing perpetrators in prison, and just to add to this, this is about reviewing under the sort of rubric of fatality review. It's not about conducting necessarily forensic interviews, and it's not about conducting an investigative interview in general, which of course have a different tone to them. So we'd like to cover the following 7 broad areas in this PowerPoint. We'd like to talk about preparing for the interview, gaining access to perpetrators of intimate partner homicide, both male and female perpetrators. Dr. Ferraro is going to focus on talking about her work with female perpetrators. I'm going to focus more on my work with male perpetrators. We are then going to explore some of the broader contextual considerations that both inform our conversations with offenders and provide better insights, I think, and some perspective on what we might find and how we might do our work. Dr. Ferraro will take the lead on conducting respectful interviews with perpetrators, and then we will begin to move towards a conclusion by talking about incorporating perpetrators' recommendations and insights for prevention, and how we might go about that, how we would conclude an interview, and then finally how we would bring that information back to the team. So that's the direction today, and a reminder that this webinar will be recorded, so you'll have access to that as well.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk about the steps you should take prior to beginning your interview with a perpetrator. So obviously the first thing you want to do is, as a fatality review team, get together and discuss what it is you want to learn from this interview. And on our team, we usually will send out an email to everybody asking for specific questions that people would like to have asked during the course of the interview. So that's the first step. You should also take time to review all the information that's available in the file prior to conducting the interview with the perpetrator. For one thing, that will allow you to identify which information in the file is public and can be discussed, and which is private and confidential that you do not want to reveal to the perpetrator during the course of your interview. You should also try to determine whether or not the perpetrator has an ongoing relationship with the surviving child or children from the relationship. In some cases, this may be a very painful reality for the perpetrator. For women that I've worked with, often they're unable to have any contact with surviving children, and it's one of the worst consequences for them of punishment. Other people may have criminal cases ongoing that relate to the surviving children, so just try to determine what that relationship is. You should also try to learn what the perpetrator's position is on their role in the homicide. They will most likely be incarcerated and have completed the criminal proceedings determining their guilt. Nevertheless, there will be some perpetrators who maintain that it was an accident, or that victim killed themselves, or some other interpretation, and it's very good to be aware of that prior to interviewing them. Make sure that you select people from your team who are going to be the most appropriate interviewers. By the time you get to the interview with the perpetrator, you will have read a lot of material and perhaps interviewed family members and survivors of the homicide that can engender some very powerful emotions, and you want people at the interview that are going to be able to to listen in a non-judgmental, empathic manner to the perpetrator, and don't overwhelm them with too many people. You probably don't want more than 4 people at that interview at the max. Our team has a therapist who works with offenders, and she always goes to interviews with the perpetrators, and that's very helpful. And then make a decision about how you're going to record the interview, whether or not you will be able to use a tape recorder, and be aware that if you decide to tape record the interview, that then someone is going to probably have to transcribe that, and that's labor intensive if you don't have those resources. Or you may take some notes during the course of the interview. So as I said, most of the perpetrators you'll interview will be incarcerated in prison. The first step is to identify which facility the perpetrator is located in, because sometimes they can be moved around in different facilities. You can use the inmate locator on the web of your State Department of Corrections to type in the person's name, and it will identify which facility they're located at currently, and then send a letter to that person explaining the purpose of wanting to interview them, and emphasizing that the interview would be to help other people who are facing problems with domestic violence. If you have someone on your team who has a relationship with the prison, that's the best person then to contact the warden if the perpetrator agrees to an interview, and try to set up the interview through the warden of the prison. And then if you get permission from both the perpetrator and from the prison to conduct the interview, go online and find out what the rules are for the visits and for dress during visits. Some prisons prohibit a certain color of clothing, or blue jeans or khakis that might look like a guard's clothing. Some prisons don't allow sleeveless attire. Certainly you would dress modestly anytime and professionally anytime you enter the prison. And just know what kind of security you'll be going through as you enter the prison. Try not to take anything that you don't absolutely have to have during the interview. Don't wear ostentatious jewelry, or if you can avoid it, just leave your jewelry at home. And have a plan B, because I found a lot of times you'll think one thing is going to happen and you get to the prison and something else happens. So you may be planning to use a tape recorder and then arrive and find out that that's prohibited. And so have some paper and something to write with when you get there. Probably most of your state statutes regarding fatality reviews will require that all appellate issues have been concluded if you're reviewing the case. But if you're going to go into the prison and interview the perpetrator, make sure that all the appellate issues have been concluded so that nothing will taint the interview and that you won't feel that you are learning something that could compromise appellate issues. Explain to the person you're interviewing that you have no legal influence in their release or privileges, and their participation won't result in any of these privileges. Sometimes perpetrators will continue to maintain that illusion, but make sure that you try to express that to them. And also let them know that if during the course of the interview they reveal something about abuse of a child or another offense, that you will report that to the appropriate authority. Many of you that would be doing the interviews are legally mandated to report child abuse, but everybody would definitely be ethically required to report revelation of other kinds of offenses that might occur. So you want to let the person know beforehand that that's your position. And then you also want to make sure that there are no civil issues pending regarding compensation or torts that the perpetrator might be involved with. And as I mentioned, you want to review as much of the material on the case as you can prior to conducting the interview with the perpetrator. For one thing, that will identify questions that you want to learn more about in the course of the interview. And then also the file will have forensic and witness and prior criminal record data that might vary from what the perpetrator tells you. And so that's not in order to contradict the person, but just so that you know as interviewers in your own mind what evidence does exist in the file, and that can guide the questions that you might ask. Not to necessarily call the person out on a misrepresentation, but just so that you can guide questions further to explore their interpretation of what happened. And finally, the perpetrator will assume that you know something before arriving, and they won't want to go through every single detail of the case prior to beginning on their own story.
So I'd like to now talk a little bit more about some of the broader contextual issues, and we're talking about looking at the situation, the life situation of the perpetrator in order to appreciate the situation they found themselves in the lead up to the killing. And in order to do that, we need biographical information, we need information about trauma they've experienced, but we also need information about their social, their economic situation, the area, the neighborhood that they lived in, etc., etc. So there are many, many things to consider in this regard. And so we thought it was important for us to spend some time talking about some of these issues and some of the research that informs these discussions. So we talk a lot these days about the role of trauma over the life course, but as someone who has interviewed between 40 and 50, mostly male offenders who have killed, I've certainly drawn a lot on the literature on trauma and the researchers who've pioneered in that area. And James Garbarino and James Gilligan are two stellar examples of folks who've done some terrific work in that area. So I'm going to refer to their work, also in the work of others. But we need a sense of the possible role of trauma over the life course of the offender. We know that in some ways, like victims, perpetrators have been traumatized, and it appears that that is one area to focus on. I'm also going to talk in this section about what some researchers have referred to as type 3 trauma, very specialized, very intense trauma that has peculiar and particularly acute effects on behavior and emotional conditions of perpetrators. I'm going to talk about polyvictimization a little bit. I'm going to talk about the complicated role of gender, male and female perpetrators, and Dr. Ferraro and I will take separate directions here. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the psychological and emotional development of the perpetrator and how we might frame that. So let me commence by quoting from the excellent work of James Garbarino in regard to perpetrator biographies and the social milieu within which they developed. Most male killers are best understood, according to Garbarino, as untreated, traumatized children who inhabit and control the minds, hearts, and bodies of adult men. Now, most perpetrators of intimate partner homicide, and we don't have a specific literature on intimate partner homicide in the way that we might have, and we need more data on this, but I think it's fair to say that most perpetrators have these histories of trauma over their life course. And I want to distinguish, following the work of the American psychiatrist Ter, who published this work in 1991, I want to distinguish between type 1 and type 2 trauma. By type 1 trauma, we're talking about someone who experiences a single traumatic event in their lives, such as something like a rape or witnessing murder, or perhaps, for example, the falling of the Twin Towers. If someone's aged maybe 3 or over, they are going to retain the memory of that particular trauma. Many people have traumatic experiences in their lives, but if it's a type 1 trauma, it is something that one's resilience over time can adjust to and deal with. Type 2 trauma, and here we're ratcheting up the stakes a little bit in terms of the intensity of the trauma, really refers to repeated exposure to extreme external events. And here we might see, for example, repeated sexual abuse by, for example, family members. And usually one will retain the memory of that trauma if, again, one is of a suitable age to do that. Now, Ter's original research on type 2 trauma was built upon by subsequent researchers. But you can see here on the little pyramid that we've got adverse childhood experiences clearly affecting neurodevelopment. We have social, emotional, cognitive impairments, adoption of health risk behaviors, various behaviors that are risky. We have vulnerability, predispositions maybe to disease, to disability, social problems, and early death. I mean, the relationship between trauma, these adverse childhood experiences, and the adverse life effects over time have been very well documented. And we see this with perpetrators, and we need to be aware of this with perpetrators. This will impact the nature of our exchange and our conversations with them, our work with them, and it will impact the nature of their memory, their recall, and various other experiences that they may have during our interviews. And we want to conduct respectful, ethical interviews. So it's important to bear this in mind as a broad contextual frame. Now, Solomon and Hyde came along in 1999, and they took Ter's type 2 trauma, that category, and they said, let's refine this a little bit and split it into 2 categories. So they called these categories types 2 and 3. And type 3 trauma is of particular interest to us because we suspect, again from our experience and from the research literature, that many domestic violence killers, be they male or female, are operating with type 1 and 2 trauma, but particularly with type 3 trauma. So we need to spend a little bit of time unpackaging this type 3 trauma, and definitionally we want to acknowledge, first of all, there are multiple pervasive events beginning at an early age and lasting for a long time. And that might include things like particularly sadistic abuse by a parent or other significant adult or caregiver in their lives. And type 3 trauma clearly has the most serious psychological and emotional consequences over the long term, and again is clearly related to acts of violence and antisocial behavior and other outcomes in offenders as they develop over time. So it's this type 3 trauma that is particularly helpful for us to understand. And just to define this so that we're all on the same page, basically when we're talking about psychological trauma, we're basically talking about the effects of an event or a series of events that cause intense fear, that result in various degrees of relative helplessness or horror that may overwhelm the normal coping mechanisms, defense mechanisms that human beings have, and that may tend to militate against them developing resilient strategies to handle life. So this is an overwhelming cumulative effect over time. Now, certainly I've interviewed perpetrators, and I know Dr. Ferraro has had a similar experience, we see people who as children were often or claimed to have been often the victim of multiple perpetrators, be these sexually abusive, physically abusive, emotionally abusive individuals. One or more of those individuals may have been close relatives, parents, as I said earlier, and the particular issue here is that in some ways, the closer the connection, the more damaging that is in terms of the development of trust and the undermining of the ability to attach and all the other effects that come with that. So that type of trauma impacts the ability of someone, the perpetrator that we're interviewing, to have developed attachments, trusting attachments, intimate connections with other human beings through the life course. So being cognizant of that is really important for us as we are trying to build rapport and build connection through the interview in order to try to understand the offending behavior and the biographies of those individuals and the relationships they were in and their relationships to various systems that we hope can address at least some of this deleterious behavior. So often those folks will have experienced abuse that is frequent and, again, importantly, unpredictable. So sometimes that may come out of left field. So again, this, in a sense, primes those individuals in intimate relationships in a way that makes it more difficult for them to handle what they perceive to be the unexpected in their relationship. And as I'll talk later, these folks, because of their impaired ability to attach, have a very strong tendency sometimes to be sensitive to rejection. So we can see how these things build upon each other. So our relationship with those folks in the interview is very, very important. Now, generally with that type 3 trauma as well, there is some kind of force used, and sometimes it is sadistic and particularly cruel. So the impact of that is if they present for treatment at any point, or if they're even receiving treatment or some kind of intervention in the penitentiary or in the jail setting where you may be interviewing them, they may present with a deep feeling of suicidality and hopelessness, and also not be able to consciously access those feelings. They may not be able to articulate clearly where they're coming from. So when we say with offenders that their understanding of their own plight is sort of, in a way, undeveloped, and I don't mean that negatively, it's undeveloped, but it's understandable that it's undeveloped or inchoate. So the trauma impacts their ability to share, their ability to remember, etc. So the big picture point for the Fatality Review interviewer is that they may be reluctant to trust. They may be willing to talk, but they may be reluctant to trust. So building the trust from the base of understanding the very strong likelihood of the trauma is really important. So they are also going to have very high abandonment anxiety that they've carried through often from their relationships. And we see this with batterers in general. Many of them, probably a good majority of them, who are angry, misogynistic batterers, have this abandonment anxiety. We may see that less so with the sort of what some people refer to as the antisocial personality disordered batterers or the psychopathic batterers, but nevertheless, the abandonment anxiety is important. So there's a tendency in the interview, if you don't remember that, even the slightest distraction or appearance of, not paying attention and not being there with their story can feed that abandonment anxiety and increase the distance between you. And I know Dr. Ferraro is going to go back to that. Significantly, they may not remember their experiences, either their experiences directly involving the killing, the events leading up to it, or other aspects of their case. So in other words, they may be amnesic for significant parts too of their childhood. I conducted an interview recently, just last fall, in a penitentiary with a man who had killed his intimate partner after a long period of abuse, and it turned out that he had abused a number of women prior to that and had been in and out of the system as well prior to that, maybe up to 30 times. But when I questioned him after having read the files and communicated to him that I'd read the files, when I asked him about his life and the lead up to the tragic outcome, the killing, his response was first of all to deny and to rationalize and explain away the killing as an accident, as something that the victim was partly responsible for, that the victim contributed to or precipitated in some ways by her behavior. And when I asked him about his early childhood, he said to me, "I can't remember anything before I was age 14. When I was age 14, I had a fight with my father. I was winning. He took a 2x4. He hit me over the head with it and beat me with it. And the last thing I remember was being hauled away on a stretcher with my legs twitching, heading towards the ambulance." He said, "I couldn't remember anything prior to being 14. This young man had a long history of drug and alcohol abuse as well." So again, the amnesia, and we can return to this, but the amnesia is significant. Is it genuine? That's an open question. We are also going to find our perpetrators being hyper-vigilant, being very finely attuned and sensitive to our presentations of self in those interviews. They grew up being hyper-vigilant. It was in their interests to be hyper-vigilant. This may not just reflect a sense of paranoia, itself a very uncomfortable condition to be in, but it may reflect a genuine survival strategy, an adaptive strategy to living in acutely troubling circumstances, either in their neighborhoods or their families. Now, another thing to pay attention to that is clearly related to trauma is that the perpetrator you're interviewing may also exhibit signs of dissociation during the interview. So in other words, there may be varying degrees of detachment or people appearing not to be present when you're interviewing them, even although they're physically present, maybe opposite you at the table. And I just wanted to throw a word out about this. I mean, Dr. Ferraro and I both experienced this, where people's physical form appears to change, where their affect, their emotional demeanor seems to change in the course of an interview. So being forewarned is forearmed about this, getting a sense of that. This isn't just something that's fabricated or the stuff in the movies. This happens from time to time, and unless you're prepared for it, potentially, it doesn't happen very often, but nevertheless, understanding those levels of detachment and the way in which that dissociation served the interests, especially of these perpetrators when they were young children, given their traumatic circumstances, understanding that is very important. So the perpetrator may also be wrestling with a number of other things in their lives. They may be wrestling straight with PTSD. They may be engaged in various forms of denial or repressing how they feel, because how they feel is so explosively damaging potentially to them and others. They may experience also an emotional numbing. As we've mentioned, interpersonal distrust. Their anxiety levels are going to be very, very high, potentially, extremely high, as though they're buzzed, as though they maybe need some medication to bring them down. At the same time, paradoxically perhaps, in seeming contradiction, is they may suffer chronic depression or suicidality. You know, an important question to ask batterers or ask of batterers cases in the field is, you know, are they suicidal? Are they experiencing chronic depression, etc.? Feelings of shame are going to be prominent aspects sometimes of cases, and revisiting cases from the knowledge base that we have may involve talking about things that offenders did even post-killing, maybe to the body, that will bring incredible shame back to the perpetrator, that the perpetrator may or may not feel comfortable sharing. You're also going to see, and again this is following Solomon and Hyde's earlier work, pioneering work, that perpetrators are going to have a foreshortened sense of the future. That goes along with their hopelessness. They're also going to be potentially very rageful. So bearing that in mind, it's important to work with authorities in the penitentiary to make sure that the interview that you conduct is safe and secure for everyone concerned. You're also going to see a lot of narcissism potentially, which in some ways is the other side of the coin with the shame, and dissociation, as I mentioned, and a lot of potential impulsivity as well. So all these things go with type 3 trauma, and all of these things are things that we need to pay attention to and be cognizant of. Now, another language in the literature, another term in the literature that's in vogue at the moment is polyvictimization. And here we may see multiple forms of victimization by multiple perpetrators from early on in life. And we've already talked about this, but we're also talking about violence here by strangers. So not only family members, we're talking about community violence, and we're also talking about accidental injuries and loss, other things that happen. And it may appear that this may be bad luck, but actually when you look at it, these are sort of socially and economically situated injuries and losses that occur much more in certain sectors of the population than others. So polyvictimization is more likely to be associated with trauma than repeated victimization of just one single type or by one single person. So the studies on polyvictimization are clear. 10% plus of the population suffered 7 or more of these types of victimization. So this operates, as I said, at individual, group, neighborhood levels. And the research there is Finkelhor et al.'s work, 2011. So a word now about different types of perpetrators, and I'd like to say a few words about male perpetrators, and then Dr. Ferraro will segue in with a conversation about female perpetrators. But with male perpetrators, the domestic violence movement, the language and the analytical criteria that we've used for the last 30 or 40 years basically sees male perpetrators as having this desire for power and dominance and control, sort of situating this violence amidst a much broader context related to the overall oppression of women in patriarchal societies. So in many ways, this slogan has been helpful, has drawn attention to the issue, and has drawn attention to the fact that intimate partner homicides are gendered. They're gendered by perpetration and they're gendered by motive. Men do this a lot more than women. And men indeed are much more likely to be intimate terrorists than women. However, some of the downsides of this when we're interviewing perpetrators, if that's how we see it, if that's how we see the male perpetrator going in, we sometimes tend to miss the complexity of the situation of those offenders and therefore limit the yield from that interview in terms of instructing us about how to build systems that are more sensitive to the needs to intervene and prevent and to work with perpetrators and victims alike. So this desire for power statement implies there's some kind of conscious plot here. And as we've said, the trauma perpetrators experience tend to suggest that it's more complicated, that it's a mix maybe of calculation, manipulation, but also undeveloped feeling and sort of directionless behavior and impulsiveness as well. Now, clearly, male perpetrators are going to differ in terms of their socioeconomic background, their class background, race, culture, sexual orientation. All of these things are very important to bear in mind in terms of how we approach offenders. If we think from our treatment modalities that intervening with these men requires us to have them acknowledge their power and their privilege as men and their sense of entitlement as men, that is somewhat problematic, because if you talk to African American men, for example, in the inner city who are deeply impoverished, who earn, for example, less than black women, or Indian men in reservations, etc., these are very problematic issues. So what we want to recommend is that folks acknowledge the power of these guys, male perpetrators, over women, physically, in terms of maybe their bullying behavior, their attempts to regulate and control and survey, all of those things. We certainly don't want to downplay that, but at the same time, we want to recognize elements of their own powerlessness. So this is the paradox at the heart of our work that we need to carry into the interview medium in the prison or wherever. So we need to recognize that controlling behavior and the directionality of controlling behavior is not something that's simple and linear or unidirectional or goes in one direction. And we cannot attribute too much intent and too much motive by using the language of tactics, because sometimes we don't see that. And it may not just be an element of denial or manipulation that the perpetrator is avoiding going there. The perpetrator may well genuinely have not felt that they had those aspects of their behavior in their sort of behavioral repertoire. So we see a mix of batterer behavior. But we also want to be careful, because clearly people behave through unconscious drives. Their behavior, including their violence, may be driven through biological forces, unconscious drives, and it could be too that there are simply inexplicable forces at work here. So complicated stuff to bear in mind as we move through. Now, another important aspect of male perpetrators is what Downey and Feldman refer to as their rejection sensitivity, their sensitivity to being rejected. I already prefaced this earlier on in the conversation, but Downey and Feldman, from their research, define this as the disposition to anxiously expect, readily perceive, and overreact to rejection. Rejection-sensitive men were jealous, suspicious, sought to control their partners' contacts with others, etc. And this, obviously, as we've said already, this is associated with past trauma and the need to be watchful, to be sort of sentries in their own lives, if you like. And that kind of predisposition reflects not only their physical vulnerability, but also their psychic vulnerability. But it also, in their relationships with their intimate partners and perhaps with others, has given them license to engage in aggressive behavior, maybe controlling behavior. So in a sense, their trauma and their past has legitimized their aggression. And this may be an aspect of just simple self-preservation, preserving their safety, engaging in what they might refer to as a preemptive strike in some way, but just by guarding against what James Gilligan, in his wonderful book Violence, refers to as psychic annihilation. And there's a long literature in the homicide and the homicide-suicide literature that refers to, actually the language is catathymic experiences, the sort of catathymic reaction, the release of emotional tension through the act of homicide, which is a very curious phenomenon, but it's an aspect of the lives and biographies of these offenders. And offenders often genuinely believe they are morally entitled to engage in defensive action, preemptive strikes, things like that. And of course, in extreme form, this may be how they saw their homicidal behavior, their act of violence that forms the subject of your visit to the penitentiary. Now, again, James Garbarino's excellent book, Listening to Killers, and I would recommend reading both of those books, Garbarino's book and Gilligan's book, before engaging in perpetrator interviews. But Garbarino makes the powerful point that many of these offenders, especially in inner city America, grow up with what he refers to as sort of a war zone mentality. And their behavior that we may see as abhorrent and heinous and monstrous may constitute a normal psychological development out of an abnormal situation. So where we see zones of concentrated poverty, their behavior may be somewhat understandable given their backgrounds. And again, as we said at the front end, we're not here to excuse that behavior or to justify it or condone it in any way, but we're here to understand it. And if we want to understand it, framing it completely and comprehensively is really important. So we've recently helped groups in Detroit, and we're still working with groups in St. Louis and Detroit to set up fatality review initiatives. And when we look at some of the intimate partner homicides in those cities, we clearly are dealing with zones of intense poverty and with deaths of despair in many ways.
Oh, well, thank you. I'd like to turn now to a discussion of interviewing female perpetrators. The majority of the interviews that I've conducted over my life have been with incarcerated women who have killed either their abuser or someone else as a result of their battering. And one of the people who's done some really important, beautiful work on incarcerated women is Beth Ritchie. And Beth Ritchie writes, incarcerated women are confined by social conditions in their communities, restrained by their family circumstances, severely limited by abuse in their intimate relationships, and forced to make hard choices with very few options. And this quote really encapsulates the experience of so many women who kill that have felt that they have no other options and have very limited opportunities to survive, and they're driven to use lethal violence in self-protection. We know from the limited research on female intimate partner homicide offenders that the majority of them have experienced prior abuse by the person that they've killed, by their intimate partner. And Gettings' work from 1985 found 71% of women who had killed their partners had experienced prior abuse by that person. And Dr. Websdale's research on intimate partner homicide found that 83.3% of the women who killed their partners had experienced prior physical battering, not only emotional, but physical battering. And going back to Wolfgang's early research on homicide, he found in 1958 that women were twice as likely as men to engage in victim-precipitated homicide, meaning that they didn't act unilaterally, they were acting in response to some behavior on the part of their victim. And you know, I think all of you know that the majority of intimate partner homicides are perpetrated by male offenders, and so most of the interviews that teams do are with male offenders. But a number of teams around the country, Georgia in particular, has done excellent work with female perpetrated intimate partner homicides. Whoops. Now, having said that, I do want to recognize that not all women who kill their intimate partners act in self-defense in committing that homicide. And so there are cases in which we know that prior abuse occurred, that they were in abusive relationships, but that the homicide was not an act of self-defense. And clearly our legislation has recognized that self-defense for a person who's in an abusive relationship has a different meaning than it does for those who are not in such a relationship or who are kill a stranger. So that the meaning of acts and the threat of acts for a person who's been abused by someone else over a long period of time is very different. And so self-defense can expand outward and be more non-immediate for those people. But even with that expanded definition of self-defense, there are cases where women kill their intimate partners where it is not a matter of self-defense. And we can think of cases where both people are really engaged in high levels of violence and abuse against each other. And again, we recognize these are a minority of cases, but they definitely occur. Our team was able to do a near-death review that involved a high level of bidirectional violence between husband and wife over many, many years. And we wouldn't have understood that complexity of that unless we were able to interview both the man and the woman in that marriage as well as their adult child. Another impetus for a woman killing her partner is increasing levels of financial problems, and perhaps her own perception that the only way she can survive financially is through the death of her partner. It may also be a preemptive act on her part if she recognizes that the financial problems are going to result in severe abuse of her. I reviewed one case where the mortgage was about to be foreclosed, and the woman waited with a loaded gun for her husband to come home and then shot him. Fortunately did not kill him. But her perception was that once he found out about the foreclosure, that she was in for a terrible beating. But at that time, it was not a self-defensive action. Another pattern is a revenge homicide, where the woman has suffered for many years as a result of her husband's abuse, and she decides she's going to get back at him. And related to that is a new partner comes on the scene, and the woman finds a man who is kind and adoring and affectionate, and she wishes to eliminate the abusive partner. There's also cases where either this new partner or another person decides that they are going to teach this abusive man a lesson, and the lesson becomes a homicide. And of course, if the woman has discussed this lesson prior to the event occurring, she will be charged with homicide as well. And in some cases, it's very unclear, it's impossible to know whether or not the woman intended for the homicide to be perpetrated by this other person, or that it just was a situation that got out of hand. But in many cases, they will be held equally responsible, and sometimes even more responsible, get a longer sentence than the person that actually committed the murder. And then finally, there are women who kill their partners because of a serious mental illness, and for some of the reasons that Dr. Websdale identified in having a very high perception of threat as a consequence of a lifetime of victimization, that they perceive a threat on the part of their partner, even if other people would not see that. And then there are female perpetrated homicides that occur without any prior abuse by the victim. When I first started working with domestic homicide back in the early 80s, there was not widespread public knowledge about intimate partner violence or about intimate partner homicide. And so when these female perpetrated homicides occurred, they often didn't even frame their abuse as domestic violence. And were surprised to hear that language because it was new to them. That's not the case today. Today there's a widespread discourse about domestic violence, and it's a narrative that's available when a homicide occurs. And certainly the majority of people who kill don't invoke abuse facetiously or falsely, but it is a possibility. There may not have been prior abuse, and the female perpetrator may not even claim that there was prior abuse. I have interviewed women who said, no, he wasn't threatening me. It wasn't that. That's not what happened. And they may claim that there was prior abuse, but there's no corroborating evidence, and there's contradictory evidence. Now, we know that there can be cases of severe abuse without any corroborating evidence, because some women never report their abuse. And so it's possible that the homicide occurs and there is no corroborating evidence. However, there's also situations where there's no corroborating evidence and there's contradictory evidence. So there's eyewitnesses to her abuse of him. There's eyewitnesses to her falsification of abuse. And there's police reports about her abuse of him. However, when we have cases of women who kill their intimate partners absent any prior victimization, the majority of times there will be a lifetime of polyvictimization, similar to what Dr. Websdale described earlier, in the sense that they have a very pathological childhood and a resulting psychological disturbances that lead to high levels of perception of threat, the inability to form an intimate relationship with a partner and to trust that partner, and a high level of paranoia about what that person is doing to them and causing them, and in some cases psychopathy, where they really don't have the capacity to recognize another human being as a human being. So it's important to explore the psychological and emotional development of the perpetrator to really understand what happened to them and why did this homicide occur. And so some of the things you want to look for are, were there early signs of psychological disorder? Did they ever have a diagnosis? Were they prescribed medication for a psychological condition? Were they held back in school? Did they have problems learning? Were they developmentally delayed? Many times you'll find that they've repeated classes or were held back, or in some cases went to special schools or no school at all. Were they depressed and anxious and aggressive children? Were they the bullies? Were they cruel to animals? Did they harm animals? Did they have PTSD prior to the homicide? We know that the majority of people that perpetrate homicide are diagnosed with PTSD, but did this PTSD exist prior to the homicide? Because that may have been part of the psychological context in which they felt that homicide was their only alternative. And of course, was there a significant head injury? And now I'm talking about both men and women perpetrators here, because we know that there's a correlation between head injury and aggression and violence toward people in one's family.
So, to return to some earlier points that I made, we can look at emotional biographies and psychological development, which is very important, but we also want to recognize that those things like adverse childhood experiences are potentiated or intensified by the effects of things like poverty and economic inequality, and we want to definitely document those links, hence the importance of learning about neighborhood, upbringing, street violence, and stuff like that. So if just with a broad sweep, about a third of Americans score 0 on the adverse childhood experiences scale. A relatively small percentage, 2%, have scores of about 5 or more. And a very small number, 0.1% roughly, score 9 to 10. So what we're talking about here with the prison population of killers, we are probably dealing with some of the most intensely traumatized people in the social body in general. So this again is important to know as we go in. And it's also clear that from the research of Kawachi and many others who've analyzed homicide rates in the US states, and found that as the gap between rich and poor increases in those different states, so too does the homicide rate. There's a clear link between those phenomena, and actually the World Bank published an international study on a similar phenomenon. So the experience of acute economic disadvantage coupled with the adverse childhood experiences that we've already talked about are going to compound the trauma. And it's important that we reframe that. And it's also important to recognize, too, that income inequality, Kawachi's work, for example, found that income inequality explains 74% of the variance in murder rates in the US and about half the variance in the aggravated assault rates. So it's an important phenomenon. But perhaps even more important is social capital, or the lack thereof. And here we're talking about social trust, cooperation between people. And obviously with male offenders, but also with female offenders, not being involved in wholesome, supportive social networks where trust is built in communities. If you can't walk down the street because you live in a war zone, or you live in an area where there's gunfire or frequent public violence, this too is something that we want to know. So that explains even more of the variance than the inequality. We want to know about their upbringing in terms of their parents, their familial relationships, for example. We want to know if parents were present, and I mean emotionally present, not just physically present. We want to know if they were absent, if they were incarcerated, or if they were mentally ill, whether they were substance abusers, and if they're substance abusers, they may not have been emotionally present or indeed physically present. We want to know if those parents were murdered. Very sadly now, we're beginning to find that there is a very small number of domestic violence offenders who have killed their intimate partners, and they themselves lost their own parents 20 years or 15 years prior to intimate partner homicides. A very small number, but we're now beginning to see those blips on the radar, and they're very disturbing blips. So again, these biographies of disadvantage, losses to illness. Of course, we know that illness is socially distributed, serious physical disability as well. All of those things are impediments, and they make it difficult to function, and they affect the interview exchange, and having an awareness of that is critically important. There are also other things that we might want to be conscious of. Was the family that the perpetrator grew up in undocumented in some ways, uneducated in some way, non-English speaking? This whole area of education is really important. There is Erich Fromm's famous work on what we would call now maybe intimate terrorism, but his work on psychopathy, his work on escape from freedom and tyrannical behavior really talks about the importance of understanding psychic scarcity, the lack of stimulation, especially in early childhood. And we want to know what those early childhood experiences were for those offenders, because again, that may help our understanding of what they brought to that relationship or didn't, and what indeed influenced their behavior. So were there cultural barriers to seeking help, mental health work, or even domestic violence services? So we're now going to move on and talk about the respectful interview.
So all of the background about these childhood experiences is to locate the purpose of the interview in understanding the perpetrator. And so you approach the interview with respect, despite any kind of negative feelings you might have developed as a result of what this person has done to other people. This interview will be done respectfully. So you explain to the person that you've read the file and you know the outlines of what happened, so your purpose is not to revisit the act of killing. Although if they would like to talk about that, they can, but that's not the main purpose. The main purpose is to understand what happened to them and what their life was like. And so you distinguish this from a fact-finding. They will have undergone a lot of interviews regarding their offense, and this is not for that purpose. So it's, as Dr. Websdale said, it's extremely important to establish rapport in the best way you can. In some settings, you may not have an open room where you can sit without any barriers, although in most situations you should be able to have that. We know from this scholarship on police interviews that officers who are able to establish rapport with an offender obtain a much richer and more detailed narrative from an offender. And so there's not only a human rights perspective on being respectful, but also you will have a better interview if you can establish rapport with the offender. So you reassure the person that you're not there to judge them, although they will know that you're judging them. In my experience with women, they always assume that I am judging their behavior, even if I try my best to display to them that I'm not. And let them know how grateful you are for their willingness to participate. They're doing the team a favor by sharing their knowledge and their life stories. So you use the skills. Many of you on the webinar today are victim advocates, or you work with victims, so you have these skills of conducting an empathic, respectful interview. You make eye contact with the person, let them know that you're listening and paying attention. Don't be distracted, as our students are with their cell phones in class. You don't look at other material. Let them know you're paying attention by verbal interjections. I understand. Yes, I understand. Don't say, I know how you feel, because you can't possibly know that. Use your empathic listening skills. Show that you care about the well-being of that person by your physical responses to them as well as your verbal responses. So I think one thing that we sometimes forget with perpetrators is they have lost everything that's important to them in life. Most of them will spend the rest of their life in prison, if not 20, 25 years, the rest of their life, and they've lost their intimate partner, and they've lost their family, and they've lost everything that they've owned. And so they have a right to mourn, and they have a right to be sad about what's happened to them, and acknowledge that loss. And even though they're the one that killed their partner, it was their intimate partner that they've lost. So to pace the interview, try to open with some very neutral information that is not threatening. Where were you born? And get them to talk a little bit about the non-traumatic aspects of their life to begin with, and anticipate that the story will not be linear in chronology, and allow them to move back and forth as they will in the telling of their story. So be patient and allow their story to emerge at their own pace. Don't insist on peppering them with questions. Let them tell the story. Some people will begin to drift too far afield. I've had people who are very passionate about their religious conversion while in prison and wanted to talk a lot about the Bible or Jesus, and that's not the purpose of the interview. So gently guide them back to talking about their own lives, and encourage them to elaborate and be specific about topics. So we know that some people who've had very traumatic childhoods, when they're asked about their childhoods, will say, my childhood was great, even though they were traumatized throughout their childhood. So encourage them to talk a little bit more. Tell me more about that. Could you explain a little bit more? Give me an example of some of the things you did as a child. Talk about talking by saying, I know it's hard to talk about these things. I know it's hard to talk about painful events, and it's hurtful to remember the bad things that happened. But the interview can provide a welcome opportunity for telling their story to people who will really listen to them. And prison often is a very boring experience for people, and hearing people listen to their story is often a welcome experience, and the perpetrator will benefit from that experience. So the topics to explore include what were the compromises that this person faced that other people don't necessarily have to face. And by this I'm talking about neighborhood conditions that may be, as Dr. Websdale said, war zone conditions, where a young man, for example, may be forced with a necessity of joining a gang to survive or to protect other people in his family. What threatened them when they were growing up, and what do they fear now as adults who are incarcerated for homicide? Explore their sensitivity to threat and where that might have come from, and whether they view the world as a threatening place. As Dr. Websdale talked about PTSD, often the women that I've interviewed will have a very high level of hypersensitivity. So any noise will make them jump. They will talk about the intrusive thoughts that they have. And so you explore those with them and basically learn what the source of that was, if possible. So I'm running out of time quickly here, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about the instrumental and reactive homicides, because the majority of intimate partner homicides are reactive in nature. And by that, criminologists are just referring to the fact that it's an unplanned event that's a response to an immediate situation. They're often highly emotional events that are either filled with rage or fear or both. And the reactive type is definitely the most common kind of homicide for battered women who kill, and especially for offenders who are suffering from a mental illness. However, we do know that there are intimate partner homicides that are instrumental in nature, that they've been planned out. They may be the result of abuse, but there is clearly a plan that has occurred prior to that homicide. And I do want to say, though, that this instrumental reactive binary that is so pervasive in the criminological literature doesn't really capture a lot of intimate partner homicides, because they can include aspects of both instrumental and reactive behaviors. So they may, as I talked about, the teaching the abusive male partner a lesson, getting out of hand and becoming a homicide, it starts out as instrumental, but it becomes reactive and lethal in the situation. You want to try to explore what their relationship with the decedent was like, beginning with how they met. And often there are cues in the early meeting of the couple. As we know, they tend to accelerate in romantic commitment very quickly. Sometimes there's an element of coercion early on in the relationship. But sometimes the first years are very romantic and fun and loving, and then something intercedes to change the nature of that relationship. Sometimes that's children that come along, sometimes it's an illness or an accident, and often if there's children from a prior relationship, usually the woman's children, that will be a source of problem. I'm going to move kind of quickly, and we have 5 minutes to finish here, but you need to look at whether or not their partner that had been killed was taunting them or ridiculing them or threatening them at the time of the homicide, and whether or not there was intoxication at the time.
So we spent some time looking at the literature on possible memory impairment, and we both experienced this where folks have denied remembering the offense or the immediate events preceding that offense. And as Gilligan puts it in one of his reviews of a book, one can never know for certain what's going on or has gone on in another person's mind, or indeed sometimes in one's own. But there are a number of cases out there that give us pause. The case of Maggie MacDonald, which you can Google yourselves, as a Toronto case. She killed her first partner, claimed she didn't remember it, was released based on, in part at least, on the amnesic nature of her defense, but within a year had killed a second partner. So we have to deal with the fact that there is malingering or faking in these cases, and probably in more than not. And there are many motives here: to reduce responsibility potentially, provide an excuse not to discuss the crime. It's better for someone to say then they're amnesic rather than to refuse to discuss the crime. It looks better as a legal strategy. So these issues are important. They're associated with things like low IQ, personality disorders, poor executive functioning. There are malingering scales that one can use, although we're not suggesting that review teams do that, but certainly an awareness of this is important. There's an ongoing debate about amnesia, so just bear that in mind. There may be genuine forgetfulness, especially around the act of killing itself, which can be traumatizing for the perpetrator as well as obviously the victim. So there are various forms here which your own preparation for the case review and the interview may help you with. It can be organic, from a brain injury, case I mentioned earlier of someone having a head injury. It can be from various psychological impairments. It could be something that's more dissociative or psychogenic, again resulting from extreme trauma in earlier life. It could be linked to drug and alcohol, or it could be linked to what we've referred to sometimes as a readout, or extreme forms of rage that allegedly block memory. So these intrusive memories and ruminations are things that you're going to deal with in the interview potentially. And the intrusive memories of perpetrators are similar to those experienced by victims. And there's an extensive literature on this. They are involuntarily triggered, characterized by a low level of control, high distress, and in some case, like a flashback, they have a here and now quality. Ruminations, in other words, constant reflections, sometimes deep reflections on what happened, are frequently triggered by intrusive memories. The ruminations themselves don't cause intrusive memories. It's the other way around. But these are characteristically linked to PTSD. So the act of killing, especially a family member, is traumatic. So we're dealing with PTSD on the part of the offender, potentially. And again, the literature is clear. We've already talked about their hypersensitivity to rejection. That too is an important part of the case to look at, and will be linked to their childhood biographies, as indeed will be their paranoia potentially. So there's a lot of things operating here in these interviews to be concerned about. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ferraro for the last 5 minutes to wrap this up, and then we'll take questions.
So do you ask the perpetrator what they think could have helped the situation? What obstacles confronted them, and who could have done a better job in helping them? And ask them, what would you tell someone who was in a similar situation to prevent the homicide? And you can know the interview needs to end when the person begins to repeat themselves or cannot be guided back to the interview purpose. You may have a time limit imposed on you by the prison officials and only given a certain amount of time. But if you have an open-ended time frame, then that's when you know to draw it to a close. And try, if you can, to not end it on a traumatic note, because this person is going to go back to their cell. They're going to be alone with the thoughts that they've reignited as a result of the interview. And so if you can bring it back to the reasons why you did the interview and what you're going to do with the interview, that can help bring it back to a calmer place to end the interview. So if you've been unable to tape the interview, and sometimes you can't even take notes during the interview, as soon as you leave the prison, write down your impressions. And you can bring a tape recorder in the car with you so you can talk on the way back from the prison into the tape recorder with your impressions and what the person had told you. And then bring that information back to the team. directly, rather than your own interpretations or the interviewer's interpretations of what the perpetrator said to them, because that's very tempting for you to just share your impression, but allow the team to have the direct information from the interview and then interpret it as a group. You may need to follow up with questions. You can write to the perpetrator after you get back to the team and ask to clarify items, and you can also seek out information that may have arisen during the interview that can round out your review of the case, and then incorporate the recommendations that come out of the interview into your final report. And in doing so, remain cognizant of the importance of confidentiality guarantees, that you're not going to reveal anything in that report that was shared with you confidentially and is not public record. And I think that concludes our presentation, and now we'd be happy to take questions from the audience. This one's for me. How many questions do you usually ask, and how long are the interviews? So the number of questions really depends on how the person is responding. So some people will want to talk a great deal about their experience, and others less so. For some people, I've had women just say to me, "You just ask me questions." And other women, as soon as I meet them, begin talking and go on and on and on and on, talking about their experience. So there's no set number of questions that I ask in an interview. Generally, I want to have at least 2 hours with the person. And sometimes after 2 hours, you'll feel exhausted, because it's heavy-duty information you're getting, and the person talking to you may actually be energized by the opportunity to express themselves, but it's tiring to you. And so usually after 2 hours, I think it's a good time to cut it off. How do you frame a letter to a perpetrator in prison which will encourage involvement? So you emphasize that the reason that you want to talk to them is to gain information that will help prevent domestic homicides in the community, that we understand that they've gone through a traumatic time in their life, and we want to know what could have helped, what could make things better. And so we definitely frame it in the sense that this is an opportunity to help our community prevent domestic homicides. And I think that for our team, we haven't had anybody decline. There was one person who preferred to answer our questions in the letter instead of in an in-person interview, and that was fine. And we did follow up with other questions afterwards too. So in terms of the number of questions, we asked him about 10 questions, and he wrote answers to all of them. And then how do you feel about phone interviews with offenders? So that's another option, and I think it's a good option for people in states like Arizona, where sometimes it's hours of traveling. The last interview that our team did, they flew, and that thanks to the sheriff's office provided transportation to the team to go down and do the interview in southern Arizona. We're up in northern Arizona. So in some cases, I think a phone interview can be really helpful. And in some cases, it's also less threatening for a perpetrator to do the interview by phone. I prefer doing an in-person interview because I get a lot of information from the body language of a perpetrator. And like Dr. Websdale was talking about the dissociation, I don't think I would be able to pick that up over the telephone in the same way as I can in person, because there's a kind of glaze that comes over the person's face. And I would miss that in a telephone interview. Now, maybe it's possible to do Skype interviews. I know in our prisons there's no access to the internet, so I guess that might not work, but maybe it could be arranged with the prison officials to do a FaceTime or a Skype interview. But I think a telephone interview is a good alternative if you don't have the resources to make the trip, or sometimes if the perpetrator would prefer that mode of interacting over a face-to-face interview. Are there any other questions?
So I've got a couple of questions. This question asks, is there a standard list of questions to ask offenders? And the answer to that is really that there is not. We encourage interviewers from fatality review teams to ask open-ended questions as opposed to closed-ended questions. I mean, a mix of the two is fine, but open-ended, sort of focused conversations about what you want to know is the way to go. So this is the same question that we get around, approaching surviving family members. Do you have a standard set of questions or a boilerplate sort of language that you use? And the answer is we don't. These are human exchanges. We're interviewing other human beings. We're having conversations. So we feel that the yield from those conversations, for all concerned, including the perpetrator, is going to be dependent upon the rapport that we build, the conversation, the exchange, the interest, the empathy, the listening, etc. So there is no standard set of questions. If you have set closed-ended details that you want to drill down on, then clearly taking those in, that might be helpful. But again, as Dr. Ferraro said, you don't want to drop those in straight away. You want to build that rapport personally first with offenders. Another question, a very easy question to answer, is what is the name of James Garbarino's book? The name of the book is Listening to Killers, and it was published by the University of California Press in 2015. And that's a book that I highly recommend. If you're doing interviews with perpetrators on fatality review teams, I recommend that book. And I also recommend James Gilligan's book, which is simply called Violence. And Gilligan's work, you can clearly Google Gilligan. In fact, you can Google and YouTube both these guys and get a sense of their message from YouTube if you don't have time to read those books. Another question, is there a benefit to interviews with offenders who deny involvement? I have always found that there's a tremendous benefit to that. And it may seem strange to say that, but there may be many reasons for denying why one has committed that homicide. Even if you've been convicted, incarcerated, and your appellate issues are closed off, there may be reasons to deny. And remember, as we said earlier, that what we want to know is to understand the life predicaments of the offender and those related to that offender. So these are essentially life history interviews that are focused, that we want to learn about the offender. So even in the way that the offender denies information, even in those ways, we may learn a lot. Because we've already informed the offender ethically that we have read the files very closely and carefully. So it's not that we're putting them on notice, it's that we're expressing our interest and our concern about the case and our desire to understand. So we've done our homework as reviewers. So we've come into the case with that understanding. So the things that they deny or may appear to deny give us pause for thought, and they may require us to regroup and rethink some of the things that appeared in the file or that were elements of the trial. And that's never a bad thing. The beauty of these things is we have the conversation, we take either the recording or the transcript or the notes, our fact findings back to the team, and the team as a group incorporates that information into their deliberations, into their community recommendations, and perhaps even their state recommendations for change. So the beauty of the fatality review is in the discussion, not in whether the denial is appropriate or not, or this or that. It's the sizzle and the conversation and the improved communication, collaboration, coordination amongst team members that is the spin-off, one of the great spin-offs from doing fatality review work. So the denial, whatever form it takes, may actually improve those, what I call 3 C's, in terms of the operation of the team. So interviewing in those situations and bringing that back can still be extremely helpful. And the last question that we've got for today, and actually we're running tight on time anyway, is, are women more likely to malinger than men? And this strikes me as a rather loaded question. I have to be very careful how I answer this. I don't know the answer to this. I don't know that the research is clear on this either, because obviously discerning malingering is itself very difficult. So I don't know if Dr. Ferraro knows the answer to that from the research. Maybe she'd like to close this out and wax lyrical about that question.
I won't wax lyrical about it. I'll just emphasize that the research on homicide offenders generally is almost all on male offenders. And then the research on amnesia, psychopathy, and malingering, again, is almost all on male offenders. So unfortunately, I don't have the answer to your question, which is an excellent question and an excellent research project for someone to take on. Thank you. I think we've run out of time. Are there any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much for participating in the webinar today.
Yes, thank you very much. And just a reminder that our contact information appears on our website. Our website is ndvfri.org. Our respective phone numbers, if you want to contact us, my contact phone number is 928-523-9205, and Dr. Ferraro's contact number is 928-523-9412. We thank you for all the work you do. We appreciate that, and thank you for joining us today.